Good afternoon, those of you who are attending virtually, and hello everybody who's attending in the room here at Imperial College, about a dozen people, I think. And welcome to Dr. Sam Krevor from Imperial College, London, who's our distinguished lecturer today. And the title of his talk is From the Digital Rocks to Gigaton Scale CO2 Storage, Two Revolutions in One. Good afternoon, those of you who are attending virtually, and hello everybody who's attending in the room here at Imperial College. Carry on. Okay. Many assessments suggest that a widespread storage of CO2 in deep subsurface sedimentary rocks will be needed to avoid dangerous climate change. It's estimated that storage rates will need to be the order of 1 to 10 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050, as much good handling as in the oil and gas industry today. The management of individual storage sites is increasingly understood, with a number of projects injecting at rates around 1 million tons of CO2 per year. However, challenges remain for the scale-up of injection rates to gigatons per year. Central to these challenges are the limitations to modelling and predicting injected CO2 movement and immobilisation in the subsurface. Dr. Krevor will present research in 3 areas in which digital rock techniques are used to analyse fluid dynamics and develop models of subsurface flow across scales. 1, an exploration of the pore scale fluid dynamics, underlying the use of Darcy's law to model two-phase flow. 2, the upscale impacts of small-scale heterogeneity on CO2 migration and trapping. And 3, an analysis of the implications of climate change mitigation targets for growth rates and global resource capacity of subsurface CO2 storage. The idea that Dr. Krevor would like members to take away is that these revolutions can and will drive each other. Technology advance in digital rock reservoir characterization is revolutionizing our ability to manage subsurface fluids, just at the moment that we need it to apply our skills as petroleum engineers in rising to the grand challenge of mitigating climate change. Sam Krevor is a reader at Imperial College London, where he leads the subsurface CO2 group and is the faculty advisor for the SPE student chapter. He develops digital rock techniques to characterize CO2 storage underground with over 70 highly cited papers. He manages over £10 million in industry and government-funded research. He received his BS, MS and PhD from Columbia University and was a postdoc scholar in energy resource engineering at Stanford. Sam, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much for that. And thanks very much for the invitation to be here. So it's a real honor to be here as a distinguished lecturer, to be on the distinguished lecturer program. I was saying to him just a moment ago how fantastic of a program that's been. But it's a particular honor to be here in my home department, to be able to come around the corner from my office and speak to you all. So thanks very much for coming out this evening for this. And so is the presentation, if I press?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so there it is. So let's get into it. So it's as the summary mentioned. Please go ahead.
I just asked, through the right skin, so we can see the screen to the
yes, we can do that. Just one of the benefits of being working in this department.
Just
Is that good enough?
yeah, just before starting, for all the people following the conference from home, if you want to ask any question, please click on the link that you find below the video on YouTube. You will be redirected to a form where you can type your question, and Tim will be able to see it from his tablet and ask your question to the speakers. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much. So as for the title and the summary, we're going to be crossing scales from very small scale to core scale, very cores of rocks to the gigatons that estimates are needed to mitigate climate change. And the two things really nicely fit there. I've kind of forgotten about the abstract that I've written, but that really link these things together. Again, these are this is this is not a gimmick. These two technologies, digital rocks, is generally applicable at the pore scale, and CO2 storage grow together. They have been developed in large part starting in the 1990s, more or less by coincidence, but by virtue of that timing, they fed into each other. The demand and need to understand CO2 storage has driven a lot of the technology development in digital rocks. If you go back through the seminal papers in digital rocks, you find that is there. And similarly, the advances made in digital rocks are allowing us to do more, go faster, make better use of reservoirs in ways that will certainly help and probably are needed if we're going to approach the scale of the challenge that has been estimated for CO2 storage. So those are the themes. We started at the smallest scale. Before I go any further, and this is really, again, like to thank very much the SPE Distinguished Lecturer Program. And this is funded through the SPE Foundation, through your donations, through your fees, and a contribution from offshore Europe, as well as the AIME. I couldn't say better things about this program and fantastic interactions and dissemination of knowledge in all directions that is taking place as a result of this result. So starting with the small scale. Firstly, I want to emphasize that digital rocks is, I think a lot of folks think of it as a very academic, and some aspects of it surely are. But what we're going to get to is that it can be used for many things, and many things are of academic interests. The first things I'll cover here, but there are many applications of digital rocks that have already emerged of practical use today, of commercial use today. So we'll get around to that. But I'd like to highlight some of the leading edge. This is really kind of emerging from the university here. I'm showing an experimental setup. This is a core holder. We're doing a core flood. But this is a micro core holder. So the rock samples, instead of being centimeter in scale, are millimeter in scale, 5 millimeters in diameter, about 20 millimeters long. And it's all set up so we can inject fluids otherwise in the normal way with core floods. But a particularly unique situation here is that we're not just anywhere, we're not in the laboratory, we're at the Swiss light source synchrotron, and this is one of the brightest beam lines in the world. It's actually being upgraded to be even more powerful. And the power of that, alongside the incredibly advanced optics and computing and everything that they have to support it, means that we can take three-dimensional X-ray imagery of the fluids moving through these rocks at a time resolution of a few seconds, so 2-second time resolution. And that's unbelievable. And what it means is we can create videos of fluids moving through the pores of rocks at pore scale resolution. So here I show one of these videos. This is a cubic millimeter of rock, and I'm showing all the colors, blue, green, everything here is actually nitrogen moving from left to right through this image. We're actually co-injecting at steady state water and nitrogen. So just to kind of highlight the power of digital rock techniques, what we did when we got our hands on this laboratory, so to speak, we said, well, this is an incredible capability. What we're going to do is just validate our experimental setup by seeing something really simple and boring, which is nonetheless important. We're just going to co-inject water and nitrogen for a long time and just image that, because that is 100 years of theory and wisdom has said that the nitrogen and water just inhabit the pore space in their own networks and not much goes on. There are stable interfaces between those, and that is the underpinning theoretical justification for the use of Darcy's law for multi-phase flow. So it underpins relative permeability. Actually, we didn't think this was going to be exciting at all. That's why we did this. And as soon as we took a look, what you see is nitrogen is the last thing is stable. The interfaces are constantly rearranging. Sometimes the nitrogen flows out through this pore, sometimes it connects with this one, it flows out here. Immediately our validating, so to speak, experimental validation already turned into this kind of big discovery. So this set us off on a really long and interesting journey. The first question we asked was, how extensive is this? This was one flow condition. How prevalent is it? What sets of fluids does this apply to? Do we have to rewrite everything we know about the physics of subsurface flow and reservoir simulation and all of that? So we did the same experiments across a wide range of parameter space relevant to CO2 storage and gas production, conventional crude oil, and heavier oils. I'll explain what this graph is in a moment. So we could identify when this phenomenon happened. And just to bring a long story short, and again, I'll come back to what these axes ultimately were. What we discovered was that actually for conventional crude oil and heavier oils, you saw what the theoretical wisdom had predicted. You saw this very stable flow system, right? So people weren't entirely wrong. And it really just came down to a situation where you had a very low mobility ratio, the ratio of the viscosity of the non-wetting phase to the wetting phase, in our case nitrogen or carbon dioxide. When that's really low compared to water, you get these kinds of, so it's unstable displacement, but at the pore scale. And even during a kind of macroscopic steady state, it's happening all the time. So it's really fascinating. The vertical axis here is the capillary number. So you can think of that as the fluid flow velocity. That's really the salient variable in the definition of the capillary number. What's of interest here is that people have seen these kinds of fluctuations, but only a very high capillary number. So at flow rates that really weren't relevant to the subsurface. And so this is part of what was so, at first, scary to us, was that we were seeing this at low capillary number. So all of that is to say that this takes place at reservoir relevant conditions. So, okay, so we settled in, we said this is really applicable to CO2 storage and natural gas production. Actually, it's emerging, it's applicable to hydrogen storage as well now. And anything with that kind of gas-like non-wetting phase. But we didn't know why it happened. It didn't make sense to us either. If the fluids can flow through a stable pathway, that takes a lot less energy than if they have to constantly create new interfaces and break new ground. So we didn't understand what the energetic basis was for it. We knew we were putting enough energy into the system for it to be possible, but we didn't understand why it would do that. Usually things take the path of least resistance. So we did a lot more experiments. So here you see now really the full power of this particular synchrotron. This is many cubic millimeters. So you can see now the 1 cubic millimeter, the 1 millimeter scale down here. And this is co-injection, still nitrogen and water. Now it's from the lower part to the upper part. And what we did was a set of experiments where we saw the approach to steady state. So we're co-injecting, but we're starting with a porous media, a rock. This is a carbonate rock that was water saturated. And we watched as the nitrogen invaded. And really interesting, it gets held up at this heterogeneity, at this constriction. And then it bursts through once the capillary pressure builds up enough. And then it reaches a steady state and the saturation relaxes. You see it, there it is. Capillary pressure goes back down once it reaches steady state. So just replaying that again and again. I'm showing this particular video. We have tons of these videos. And again, if we zoomed in to 1 cubic millimeter, the richness of this data is you can see exactly what I showed a few slides ago. So all of that is there. There's a universe of physical phenomena happening in this image. It's absolutely spectacular. But I'm showing this particular image because here we got some luck. We had some experimental magic, so to speak, which is that it was held up at a single constriction. There's a single pore that all the fluids going through. And this was lucky for us because we were wondering why this fluctuation these fluctuations take place. And that provided us the last constraint we needed to be able to solve the puzzle. So now what I'm showing are 3 images of the steady state configuration of the fluid. The first on the left shows what we arrived at the end of the previous video. These aren't videos anymore. This is just the steady state configuration at different flow rates. I'm also coloring the blobs of nitrogen. I'm only visualizing the nitrogen. I'm coloring the blobs depending on how connected they are, not. And you can see qualitatively that what happens as we increase the flow rate are 2 things. Firstly, the nitrogen is able to invade more of the pore space, and secondly, it's much less connected. So those are the 2 qualitative features that that just really pop out at you. So the fluid is flowing. We just can't see the connections. And what this means is that those fluctuations are happening in between each of these isolated blocks. So that's where all of the isolation, that's where all the fluctuations are happening. So in addition to everything you can see there, this means that as we increase the flow rate, we're getting more and more of these fluctuations. And those fluctuations are enabling this street configuration. So we can see that pattern there. Okay, so here's where this particular constriction helps. Say again?
How are you flowing it? Because I don't know if the gravity is changing.
Yes, so we are flowing from the sorry.
My question is, how are you flowing this? Because
I know we've got it because it works. Right? That is not working. Right. Hello.
so sorry for interrupting.
No, it's all right.
And the question is, how are you flowing this? Because I don't know if the gravity has an effect.
Yes, so we're flowing from the bottom to the top. And so gravity is acting down in the way that you see it on the image.
From bottom down.
That's bottom up, exactly.
Bottom up.
Yeah.
Bottom up.
Yeah, that's building. And you know, the gas, the nitrogen, is much more buoyant than the water as well. So there are those things featuring in there. You know, we won't go into it, but there, you know, that could be having a role there. We won't. The story that emerged for us isn't one where gravity was a major character here, but yeah, it's all in there. Okay, so we're flowing from bottom to top. And what this particular constriction allowed us to do is, well, we have all the nitrogen flowing through that one pore. We're controlling the flow rate. So we could quantify the flow regime. So another one of the theoretical underpinnings of Darcy's law, in addition to the connected flow, is that the flow is what's called laminar. So it generally happens at low flow speeds. You can think of it as kind of the opposite of turbulent flow. So the flow moves nicely, the streamlines are as you expect. And if you go to a high enough flow rate, with fluid moving through a pipe or a pore, or in the atmosphere, the flow is no longer laminar. It transitions towards something much more complicated, much more energy intensive as well. So I think we all know from our automobiles or airplanes that a lot of work is done to minimize the turbulence that comes off the wingtips or the back of the car. And that's because if you create that situation, it consumes energy, creates drag. So in any event, in this case, we could estimate the Reynolds number, and that tells you what flow regime you're in. And what we found was that in this particular setup, we're at a very high Reynolds number, 29, which for course media is well beyond what you'd expect for the laminar regime, generally considered to be kind of below 1. It's not to say that it's turbulent, but you don't have, you wouldn't really expect it to be laminar. So somewhere in between, much more energy intensive flow than a laminar regime. So that means as we increase the flow rate, the fluid had a choice. It could increase the messiness of this flow regime, consume even more energy by continuing to stay connected and channel fluid through there, or it can make use of this intermittency. So intermittency is complicated. There's interfaces moving. It takes more energy than land airflow, but that's not the choice the fluid had. It had the choice between intermittency and this highly energy intensive flow. So suddenly we have unlocked the energetics of the system, and that's what's happening. So intermittency allows the fluid to invade much more of the pore space and continue to flow through much more of the pore space than you would expect from a simplified capillary pressure equilibrium, for example, model approach flow. Okay, so we understood the physics of why this was happening, we knew when it was happening, and we started to address the questions of whether or not this matters that much stress. So it's a very interesting topic because of the impact it has on our kind of thinking about fundamentals of subsurface flow, but ultimately we still have to evaluate when we're looking at CO2 storage, plume migrating over tens and hundreds of meters and kilometers. Do we need to change our model for relative permeability? I'd say the answer is we don't know just yet. The upscale impacts we see are that the presence of intermittency facilitates, it creates higher mobility in a sense. So in this particular example, we saw more intermittency, and this is now in terms of relevant. When the fluid was initially displacing the water, so the leading edge of a plume, for example, you'll have more intermittency, higher mobility than when you get to a steady state situation. You'll still have intermittency, but less. So it's interesting. These are just the kind of schematic of the type of effect that it might have. So that story is not yet, complete, but it's leading in this direction. So that's a kind of example of exploratory research and uncovering new physics, and ultimately not quite at a practical application. But again, I come back to this idea that I really like to hit home, is that there are a large number of commercially implemented and very interesting applications that are in use and can be used today. So, for example, we are able to use digital physics to understand low salinity flooding, and we've uncovered the combined importance of rock mineralogy and pore structure, and you can use that to create screening tools, which are much more effective than what has been possible before. You can characterize the mineral distribution and crucially the reactive surface area for reactive transport type problems, characterization completely unlocked by digital rock physics. And we can even now map the wetting state distribution of the pores of rocks themselves. Again, something that was really holding back the ability of digital rock physics to predict flow functions. And that's all. So I won't go into those in detail, just highlighting that there. Again, this question kind of hovers over it all. Does it matter? I see it as a responsibility of whether you're an academic or an industry working in this area. It's really fun to work with these new and advanced tools, but you can't run away from these questions. And so one of the ways I like to frame that is there are many reasons why this question emerges, but often it's just simply the tiny scales at which digital characterization techniques and approaches are applied. The question that emerges from that is, how could that have an impact on flow at the field scale? So I'll spend the rest of the digital rocks part of this talk highlighting one application where we've taken it all the way. And it's an application of CO2 storage. That's all about it. But I'd like to put us all on the same page here with CO2 storage. There are many variations of it. What I'm going to be talking about is more or less what I'm summarizing with this schematic. These are all modes of CO2 storage that are in practice by industry today. So there are around 30 projects around the world. They are injecting into oil fields and using with and without enhanced oil recovery. they're injecting into locations where they're very obvious structural traps. They're injecting into areas where the plume has a kind of open-ended run for many, many tens or more kilometers, and they're relying on capillary trapping, a dissolution trapping, halt the plume. So as a new technology, actually, this has been demonstrated and is in commercial deployment in a huge variety of settings and working really well. We'll come back to that. That's one of the things I like to emphasize with this. Okay, so back to the question at hand. One of the canonical problems for CO2 storage as far as subsurface flow is concerned is that it's difficult to predict where the carbon dioxide is going to go in great detail. And it's even very difficult to match the plume after it's been observed. So the most famous case is the Sleipner site. In Norway, this is also the most famous CO2 storage project in the world. It was the first in 1996, started injecting. The way you see here is a plan view of the actual plume. So looking down, as the plume has migrated along a cap rock. So it moved up oily and then it spread along a cap rock. And it moved in this northern direction. It's probably around 8 or 9 kilometers long at this point. Nothing worrisome. But what you see in the colored grid blocks is the best effort, very conventional approach to history matching with reservoir simulation. So really strenuous efforts put in place to match this, changing the reservoir properties and all of that. And you see, you're not capturing some of the salient features. We want to know where this leading finger goes because we want to know, is there potential access to a leakage pathway or a neighboring project or any number of things. So we'd like to do better. And this has been seen and analyzed for Sleipner over and over again, but it's been seen at every single CO2 storage project in the world. So here is Insula. This was a commercial project in Algeria, and the injection took place at one well, and it broke through at the observation well very, very quickly. So they invoked the existence of a fracture very coincidentally aligned between the injection and observation well in the simulations to capture this in the modeling. Here is the Decatur project in the United States. Again, the plan view outline of the plume in red and the colored best fit history match. They went way farther than the history match of the Sleipner case. They said, we're just going to put anything in this simulation to try to get it to match the plume. Very openly acknowledging, what they were doing was just to try to get the structure of the plume to match, and they couldn't. So a really interesting indicator that there's something missing in physics. So I highlight a few other projects where this has been seen that are scientific projects. So those were all the previous projects for 1 million ton per year injection. Here, these are just a few thousand tons injected deep underground. But for the purposes of scientific studies, so extremely well instrumented projects, everything and anything put down the wells to observe this and seismic and so really high resolution observations, fluid migration, very well constrained geology, and here, for example, at the Frio project, injection into a well and very rapid breakthrough, something like after 3 or 4 faster than anticipated in the kind of P90 case or P10 case, whichever one is the one. Here's the ongoing scientific project in Australia, the Babak project, probably the most famous scientific field project in the world. And they're injecting into this extremely homogeneous reservoir, and they see this very strong southeastern trend in the fluid migration that, again, it's really hard to put something in the reservoir simulation that's justified that will make that happen. So there's something with the physics. Okay, so at this stage, we know that it is almost certainly not the mystery of the physics. So there was been a lot of work on understanding whether carbon dioxide itself is fundamentally different than other fluids, and it's not. So we've really now honed in on the heterogeneity of the risk. So coming back to the laboratory and the digital rock physics theme, heterogeneity at the laboratory scale has been characterized for a long time. And in 3 dimensions, ever since the X-ray CT machine was essentially invented in the 1970s, as far as I can tell, it was almost immediately adopted by the petrophysics, by the oil and gas industry to use to image rocks. And so here you can see a typical image of porosity in 3 dimensions, very easily acquired. We've been doing this for 50 years. But what has been missing is the characterization of heterogeneity in the multi-phase flow properties. So this is the only substantive equation I show in the entire talk, and we won't go into a lot of detail, but it's what's known as, it's a formulation of what's known as the pressure equation. It's one of the fundamental equations employed or discretized by reservoir simulation. And what I've done is I've organized the forces driving carbon dioxide flow to 3 terms. There's a distance term, and all that is the pressure side. So you can imagine your injection of carbon dioxide into the reservoir, the pressure you create at the well pushes the CO2 away from the well. So that's this term here. There's buoyancy, and carbon dioxide is lighter than water, moves upwards. That's the 3rd term. And the term in the middle is a gradient in capillary pressure. And among other things, what that represents is the impacts of heterogeneity in multi-phase flow properties. So this term is almost universally ignored in reservoir simulation, and for good reason. The arguments put forth by the mathematicians and modeling folks are that this term really only pushes fluids around at the centimeter scale. Once you get to meters and larger, the movement invoked by this term is diffusive, which means it goes fast over a few millimeters and centimeters and then slows down dramatically. So you don't end up moving fluid very far very quickly. So you can ignore it because we're working with grid blocks that are tens of meters in scale at least, in fields that are hundreds of meters. But what this has done is overlooked an impact that these fluid redistributions can have at a small scale, ultimately controlling fluid flow at larger scale. So this is a schematic illustrating what that impact is or where it comes from. So imagine this is a schematic of the rock environment. So I said that these heterogeneities really only move fluids around over scales of centimeters. So we're talking about a rock or scale. In fact, you see capillary index is kind of one of the central focuses of core analysis, since core analysis began. And that's a heterogeneity in capillary pressure. So we know it has. So imagine this is a 2-layered core, or just, and fluid is flowing from left to right. If you're co-injecting water and carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide will move preferentially into the layer that has a lower capillary pressure characteristic curve. That's generally the higher permeability layer. Similarly, the water will actually move through the layer that has a higher entry pressure. It's a lower permeability layer. It will move through that because, so it can avoid, in essence, the carbon dioxide. So what that means is that if you have one layer with high saturation carbon dioxide, that will map to the part of the relative permeability curve where the mobility is high. And similarly, the water moving through the other layer will map to the part of the relative permeability curve where the water mobility is high. But the conventional approach to modeling assumes everything is constant and averaged, and you guess a much lower, factors of 10, lower mobility for the system. So that's the big impacts that these small scale heterogeneities can have in multi-phase flow. So even though the CO2 is only being redistributed a few centimeters, the impact on the mobility of the CO2, what you guess for the relative permeability, is very large. So you can bring this into modeling, no scaling, but you need to characterize it. So I've given the theoretical folks and the modelers a bit of a hard time, but the truth of the matter is probably there is a link to experimentalists. There is no straightforward way to observe multi-phase flow properties in rock cores. You can't see it like you can see porosity. And so that almost certainly had a role to play as well. If you could have characterized it, probably we would have considered it more closely sooner. And this is where so we can create imagery of the rock cores. Now we're looking at a saturation distribution of a core flood. So these are centimeters in scale. And using digital rock physics techniques, we can invert that information into heterogeneity in the multi-phase flow properties, heterogeneity in the capillary pressure characteristics in the rock core. So what I'm showing here is a history match simulation of the core flood, and they look very similar. And we've achieved that similarity by varying the capillary pressure characteristic throughout the domain. So that was essentially our tuning parameter. So we've inverted the observation for a field heterogeneous in multi-phase flow properties. We do much better actually than even that image tells us. So here I'm just plotting the saturation observed experimentally against the simulated saturation for all the fractional flows of our relative permeability experiments, and they all fall along this kind of one-to-one line within experimental uncertainty for the most part. So the history match is great. It doesn't tell us we have a physically representative model, but that's what we're after. So we do have to validate the model. So we do experiments, observe essentially relative permeability at two different flow rates. And the black curve and the black dots are the observations and are fit at the high flow rate. And that we input into the simulation. Then we characterize the heterogeneity as I've just described. With our heterogeneous model, we predict the impact of the heterogeneities at a different flow rate. And then we do an experiment at a different flow rate. So those are the blue crosses. And blue dashed line is our prediction of the observation at that distinct flow rate. So the fact that you can predict that is a validation that, at least for our purposes, what we're trying to get out of this, an upscale relative permeability at reservoir conditions, and we have a physically representative model. So this means that we can characterize the impacts of these small multi-phase flow heterogeneities in the way that we need to incorporate their impacts at the field scale. We build them into these flow functions. Doesn't mean yet that it has an impact. So we've gone through the work of doing this for all sorts of rocks. So we've demonstrated this on rocks with all different types of heterogeneities, parallel to flow, perpendicular to flow, buggy, carbonate-like heterogeneities. I won't linger on this, but we've had to develop different aspects of this approach depending on the heterogeneity, but it's doing pretty well. And one of the current active case study sites we're applying this to is the very close to home, the Endurance field, and it's the target injection site for essentially the East Coast cluster and the Endurance Alliance, Northern Endurance Alliance project. So there's a lot of publicly available information that we're able to use to build our own model of this system using our workflow. We also have rock samples that we characterize. So here you can see a cross section of the target reservoir. There was an exploration well drilled ages ago that we were able to obtain rock samples from and characterize them. The target injection for the current project is kind of down dip from that dome, and but we can see the plume move up into the dome. We'd like to know how quickly that plume is going to move, if it's going to move beyond, and any spill points, things like that. All of these things that are of interest to capture. And so we construct these really high resolution models to evaluate whether these heterogeneities are going to have an impact. We're in the business of just asking the question, does what we see at the laboratory have an impact at the field scale? And I'll get to the practical workflow in a moment. But the simulation outcomes I'll show here are centimeter in scale grid blocks, and then 5 by 10 meters in extent. They're heterogeneous, so we'll be comparing models that all we do is we take the capillary pressure characteristic field and convert it and compare simulations where that is either heterogeneous or homogeneous. So injecting CO2 from left to right, what you see is the heterogeneous model. You can see the gravity autonomy in both cases, but in the case incorporating the heterogeneities, we see breakthrough. It's at 8/1000th of pore volumes injected in this case, and it's earlier than the homogeneous model. In fact, in this particular case, it's twice as early. So breakthrough in that model happens at 0.016 pore volumes. And that is not just this particular circumstance. We create many realizations of these models. And here we're showing the plot of the relative migration speed against essentially how long the heterogeneities are, how long the layers are. And what you see is that as soon as you get to layers that are essentially 2 times the length of the thickness of the layer, you have breakthrough in the heterogeneous model. There's twice as fast or more as the homogeneous model. Those are really fast. So this kind of factor of 2 is something that we see across the board once we get essentially modestly long layers. Okay, so those are really high resolution and essentially study models. And really what you need to do to get to the field scale is use upscaling. We can't simulate the field at 7 meter length scale. So thankfully, there are approaches that have been developed to do this. So we've made use of this, and we haven't done it for the endurance field yet. Actually, we have. Those results aren't here; they're not public yet. But we had done this for as well for the Goldeneye field in the Captain Sands. So a similar situation where very publicly available information, core material from British Geological Survey, and we analyzed it all. Let me just start that again. But what I'm going to show is the outcome again of the field scale. So these are kilometers in length, so a few kilometers total domain. We release carbon dioxide from the bottom of the domain, let it move upwards, and watch it migrate along the cap rock. And there's this kind of gentle anticline. So you see there's this immediate, very rapid rise in the homogeneous model of the CO2 to the cap rock, whereas in the heterogeneous system, you get this baffling caused by the heterogeneity. The plume in the homogeneous model has already spread out a long ways because it got to the cap rock faster. But the lateral migration in the heterogeneous case is sped up so quickly, so this factor 2, that it catches up. So what's happening is you have, in essence, fingers of carbon dioxide, probably of thickness in reality around centimeters in thickness. Other grid blocks are much, these are upscale grid blocks, and but the upscaling captures that. So, but they're moving very rapidly along the cap rock. So you can see this kind of quantified. The black is the lateral migration along the homogeneous system, and then the red is kind of catching up. And so, and what this demonstrates is not only is there an impact, but there is a practical route to doing this characterization, implementing it in reservoir simulation. The upscaling technique is not particularly complicated. So I'm happy to go into details with anyone who's interested. And of course, we've published this and since done a lot of work. So that is basically the last bit of the digital run. I wanted to impress on you, there are many applications that are practical, just we think there are clear examples where not only is there a field scale impact, but there's a field scale need. So this is the way that CO2 migration, especially in these scenarios where you're requiring a system where there is going to be a lot of migration, this is really the way that you should characterize this is.
Just got to. I don't need it. Can you hear me? So I've got a question that pops out of this. So what you've modeled, does that include the dissolution of the CO2 in the water phase? So are you actually absorbing CO2 or are you just letting it race along the top?
So in these simulations and this modeling so far, we haven't included the dissolution. So we had to develop upscaling, which really included the flow physics. So we're working, so first of all, I can say is there's a really interesting dynamic with the dissolution, and it's really important. So we are actually working on now also incorporating that. But in the previous approach, where you had more or less plumes that looked like this without any kind of thin movements of the leading edge and things like that, and the amount of dissolution was fairly modest, and the timescales were such that you can almost separate them. So you get a kind of convection current sometimes set up, but that would play out over decades to centuries rather than years to decades that are needed for project management. But when you have carbon dioxide moving through very thin plumes, thin layers, the dissolution is dramatically enhanced. So we work with Jerome Neufeld's group at University of Cambridge. They take a kind of geological fluid dynamics approach and look at scaling parameters. And for example, to show that you can get dissolution in these kinds of scenarios, which is upwards of 10% of the injection rate. So these are affecting your project in real time. So that's a kind of important, ongoing, very active part of it. We had to start with the fluid flow first, and then move into the dissolution. So.
And when you got dissolution, the next thing that happens is that you get changes in mineralogy, because in essence you have a reactive fluid. So does that have to be modeled in a way as well? Is that what timescales is that significant?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't included reactive transport modeling and fluid rock interactions, and it's the conventional wisdom is that those reactions play out at even longer time scales, but of course there are always exceptions. If you have carbonate minerals, those will react very, very quickly. I'd say it's really uncertain that way. Although the chemical reactions themselves are fairly well understood, and how they play out in the reservoir and impacts and feedbacks they have on flow is really uncertain. Part of the difficulty is reactive transport modeling itself. So I talked about history matching problems with CO2 flow. We have really powerful reactive transport modelers, but they are not predictive in any way. And there's still a lot of very fundamental work that would be required to understand why we can't even match very well constrained subsurface reaction phenomena. So you can get answers from those simulators, but I would say the uncertainty on those answers is essentially unconstrained. Anyway, for the time being, we're living with conventional wisdom that in the mineralogies of these systems, the reactions are not having a big impact. They happen very slowly. Okay, so that gets us to the field scale. And the last part of my talk, I addressed some of the issues at the very largest scale, which actually it's not a smooth transition. So field scale is kilometers in scale. Whereas gigatons, as was mentioned at the start, so gigatons of CO2 injection per year, that discussion has really been driven by assessments, techno-economic assessments, that are used by organizations like the United Nations, the IPCC, but also by oil company Shell and BP produce their reports, the International Energy Agency. They all have their own versions of these models, as well as many academic organizations. And they just ask what types of trajectories would allow us to continue to maintain our standard of living, increase our standard of living globally while mitigating climate change. They're kind of least cost scenario optimization problem with all sorts of technologies represented, assumptions about growth and economy and so on. So of interest is that here I'm showing distributions of the amount of CO2 storage deployed in 2030, 2040, and 2050, which are about 75% of the model outcomes from the IPCC 1.5 degrees C assessment. It's actually not that different than the 2 degrees C assessment. And so you can see vast amounts, so from from 100 million tons per year to 10 gigatons per year in 2030 to 10 gigatons, to 6 to 10 gigatons per year in 2050. And it's essentially, the takeaway from that isn't has to be the way it is, but the takeaway is, all things considered, this is the cheapest way to get there. But many of the models right now can't achieve 1.5 or even 2 degrees C if they don't use CO2 storage. So if they ignore it, not only do the costs go up dramatically, but many of them can't even achieve the target without breaking some limit of economic hardship, which they deem to be unsuitable. So that tens of gigatons, 5 to 10 gigatons, somewhere in there is the volumetric rate of fluids handling by the oil and gas industry today. So this was kind of mentioned. It's a huge scale. And if we look at where we are, these are the blue dots, around 30 gigatons in terms of something called capture capacity. Just to get there, I plot this on an exponential or logarithmic growth axis. So these straight lines are exponential growth would require 20% annual growth sustained for 25, 30 years in CCS deployment. So it's not been achieved by the oil and gas industry. It's not been achieved by almost any large energy industry, and not at all over 25, 30 year time scales. So if we just extend what we're doing, you see that we're kind of a level below. So we started looking into why those models arrive at these outcomes. Because if we're looking at it from the subsurface perspective and the growth of the technology perspective, it is looking impossible. And the first thing that we had to do was to understand what was currently reported. So all of those blue dots I showed are captured capacity of CO2 storage projects around the world. And I think intuitively we understood that to mean some sort of maximum, the most projects could capture or store. But even that, once we started thinking about it, we didn't know. So what we wanted to know most was how much was being stored. And that information wasn't centrally compiled. So we started looking around and happily discovered that the information was, if not centrally compiled, widely reported. So projects, folks that are doing CO2 storage today came to like to make sure that everyone knows that they're doing it and how much is being done. And that makes sense because there's not much financial benefit. So and the reporting fell into a few categories in terms of essentially decreasing what we said was decreasing legal assurance. Again, most of the reporting is in the top 2 categories, which probably have similar amounts of legal assurance. So whether you're reporting to a government agency or not, but you have some sort of independently audited corporate sustainability report or environmental sustainability report, there's a really high degree of legal assurance. So we compiled all that information. And here's what we found. So just taking a snapshot at 2019, all of the projects we could find information for, this is their capture rate capacity, around 36 million tons. It's a whole story in itself, but capture rate capacity means something different for almost every project. But in any event, but of that capture capacity, 29 million tons was stored. So 80–90% performance relative to the maximum. We took that as a pretty positive indicator of performance. So the projects are doing pretty well, and we actually looked into all the reasons why they're not meeting the capture capacity or if they should be, and so there's a lot of interesting stories to learn there. But our main outcome, in addition to the information, was just that the projects that have been built are actually performing pretty well. And it's interesting because there are a lot of media narratives counter to that, which aren't really based in the reality. So we had our baseline information, and we started looking at the other part of the techno-economic modeling, which was, well, how do they constrain the use of CO2 storage? Surely they must have something like a storage capacity around the world to identify how much CO2 storage you can use. And so here we're showing just a table from some really nice papers by Cole et al., where they evaluate all of the models used by one of the UN IPCC assessments. And they show here a column of how CO2 storage capacity is represented. So you see a lot of unlimited, 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 which means that there's no constraint from the geology. So that was interesting. Where there were constraints in models, they were fairly sensible, but they were so large, they didn't have any impact on the models. So growth never was affected by the storage capacity. Also of interest was that these figures seem to all come from a report by Hendricks et al., which is really nice. And there was an update in 2004, but the figures come from a report they pulled together in 1990. And it was a really nice at the time, but ballpark estimate of CO2 storage resources around the world. That is what, if they use anything, all of the integrated assessment models use that information. Despite the huge amount of effort and great work that has gone into assessing resources around the world by government organizations, academic organizations, now the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, it's one of the most studied aspects of it. So anyway, we're showing a graph here which compiles a lot of estimates of CO2 storage resources around the world. All of the green points are an estimate. And I've organized these by location based on the size of the resource. So on the left, you have individual fields like the Mount Sinai sandstone in Illinois. On the right, you have whole basins. So like the Sarah or the Basal Cambrian sandstone regional. And the dots are organized in vertical columns because in these locations, multiple estimates have been made for the same place. That's what we're interested in here. But you already get a feel for just how much evaluation has been done. Just tons. It's been really good. But what you see is that there's a wide variation. For every location, there's a spread of 1.5 to 2 orders of magnitude in the evaluation. And what this really points to is the fact that geology alone isn't enough to tell you what the resource base is. It has everything to do with how you use them, what your development plans are, and how it gets deployed. And this is actually very similar to a discussion that was being had in the first half of the 20th century around oil and gas reserves. People are really interested in knowing how much oil was left. And it boiled down to geologists who were doing essentially what we're doing now, estimating the volume of certain geology and assigning a fraction of that geology to oil, the amount of oil, and then multiplying that. That's what we're doing for CO2. You need to do it to identify the geography of these basins, but it's not enough. And what emerged from that discussion was we had to combine our information about the geology, those volumes, with our understanding of how we produce oil and gas, or how we use the geology for CO2 storage. So at the time, there was a long, already 50 years of production history, where you can see this kind of exponential increase in production and then decline very famously. Hubbard puts a symmetric, what's known now as logistic curve, looks like a normal curve and native prediction. We don't need to worry about that, but it essentially grows the field of growth modeling of natural resources, which shows time and time again these patterns of very exponential growth, and you don't feel any constraints from the geology, followed by some slowdown. And what happens after that is fairly up to technology and demand. So we've seen that we can extend oil and gas because we're interested to do so with new technology. So the second half of these curves is really just kind of unconstrained. But what it tells you is you can map the growth trajectories in the early days, at least the first 20, 30, 40% of the resource use with these patterns of growth. And that slowdown is indicative of how the use of the resource is softly felt constrained by the storage resource. So this is the approach that we should be taking for CO2 storage, what we've done. So now the same curves on a logarithmic vertical axis, emphasizing that the second half of these curves are not realistic or predictive, but rather we're using the geological resource base as a constraint to identify growth trajectories that are realistic for CO2 storage, at least historically precedented. So what can we achieve in the next 50 years? This is what we're interested to do. It's a 3-parameter curve. It's very simple. And there's a trade-off between the growth rate, the initial exponential growth rate, and that constraint, the storage resource. So we have a framework where we can apply all of our knowledge about geology, combine that with all of our understanding of what affects growth, everything from incentives to regulatory inhibitions and development of infrastructure and so on. So, and we can put plans on a graph which represents the model in that framework, and we can identify it. Are these plans realistic? What do they mean in terms of the growth rate required and the storage resource base that they're dependent on? And does that match with what we know about growth and geology? So we've done that for the global picture, really interesting pictures. So again, here is the performance so far. And one of the things that again pops out is like growth in CO2 storage has been pretty good. 8.6% growth by this measure annually for the last 20 years since late night. That's not bad. If we just continue that to the end of the century, actually cumulatively, we need the CO2 mitigation the RPCC says is needed for many of the scenarios achieving 1.5 and 2 degrees C. So we don't get where they say we need to be in 2050, but over the course of the century, and that's what matters for the physics, really, we do store enough. So if we just maintain our rates of growth, actually, this is a major player in climate change mitigation. If you increase the rates of growth, you can achieve cumulatively the more ambitious targets. So another thing that this does for us is if we take that most ambitious target, which is really difficult, this would require, in this case, 12% sustained growth for 50 years or so. We can plot that back on our trade-off graph, and we can identify a maximum storage resource around the world that is needed to support that. So we've had tons of assessments looking at geology around the world, and numbers like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of gigatons of storage resource. It's uncertain to 1.5 to 2 orders of magnitude, as I've shown. It's a bit hard to kind of make use of that around our internet. But what you can do here is say, okay, well, the most we'll ever need in our kind of wildest dreams for the success of CO2 storage is 2,700 gigatons of CO2 storage resource. And that's really useful in itself, because we say if we identify that in different configurations, we know that this is just not going to be constrained by the geology. We put numbers to quantify it. At the moment, we can also say that this is an order of magnitude lower than all of the assessments of how much resource exists. So even if we're factor of 10 out from our best estimates, we're still in the safe neighborhood here. So we can, again, in a quantified way, say that there is enough storage resource. Okay, but getting down to the details of whether we can achieve it, it's really a lot more sensible to start applying this framework regionally. We've done this for Europe. I'm not going to linger on this, just to say that all of these regions and countries have storage resource assessments and different scenarios for CO2 storage deployment in their climate change mitigation plans. All of the black points on this graph are those plans in different configurations, and it provides a really rapid framework to do a few things. So firstly, all of the dots are to the rate of 10% annual rate sustained for 25 years, which means the plans are ambitious, and some of them are wildly ambitious. So over 15% sustained annual rate, and probably unrealistic. But if we look now on the storage resource side, and say, okay, well, let's only consider offshore. There's not very much appetite for CO2 storage onshore. So we'll only consider the North Sea, offshore UK and Norway. It's 170 gigatons, and all of the plans are here. And so all that means is that, we can achieve it. So that storage resource exists. Now, if we look at the resources of only the UK or only Norway, maybe some of these countries are interested in serving as a hub, taking all of the business. They can do it too. They can service all of the demand from all of Europe. There are all the points. It's only if those lines fell below here that it would be unrealistic. So we can go even farther down and say, well, what if our estimates are wildly uncertain and we can only make use of 10% of the resources we think exist? Again, here are the points for that. Combined UK and Norway, or Norway and UK. So very quickly we can, again, in a quantified way, say that the resources offshore UK or Norway alone suffice to service this demand. We can also identify trajectories that are more realistic and ambitious. So it seems like the combined plans of the UK and Norway and Europe are interested in this kind of 100 million ton per year mark. And if we just have a curve here, like this is a 92 million ton per year curve. So I think probably most folks, by 2050, most folks would say, okay, that's close enough. But if you plot on this trajectory, the highlighted ball of red only requires 10% annual growth for us. So we're already able to very rapidly identify much more plausible, realistic plans that nonetheless meeting the interests of policymakers and public as well. So done this for the US, and the conclusions there have analogs. I think one of interest to highlight is that the equivalent to the Norway UK situation is the Gulf Coast of America is essentially service the entire land as is projected from the United States. So the last thing I'd like to show, this is the last in the presentation, is this slide, and it comes back to our study where we were just compiling how much CO2 had been stored. Again, less than the capture capacity, and the story that often gets portrayed in the media, especially, is we only have, we're at 30 or 40 million tons of CO2 stored per year. We need to be at gigatons. This is a possibly large gap to fill. But hopefully you've heard some more positive versions of that presentation now. And I find that whenever we essentially dive into the facts and put more realism into it, this always emerges. So what I'm showing here is not a snapshot in 2019, but how much CO2 has been stored in our best estimates since 1996 to 2020 from all these projects. And if you just add that all up, again, logarithmic vertical axis, just so we can visualize everything, we're at essentially 200 million tons stored by 2020. And that is a huge achievement. And so that's equivalent to the cumulative estimates of mitigation from solar photovoltaics in 2015. And 30 million tons stored in 2018 is equivalent to half the mitigation impact that solar PV in the United States. So CO2 storage, it's in the early days project, but it's having a climate change mitigation impact today. This really speaks to the huge impact that every project has. Really has an outsized impact because of the large volumes of CO2 being stored per project. We can have 30, 40 projects around the world already having an impact commensurate with renewables. And I think it's important to also see that because it speaks to the potential. So I'll leave this, I'll come back to this and leave it for the questions. Thanks very much to my sponsors and many collaborators for all of this work. And I've left a list of references. Email me if you need any of them. And I'd like to also encourage you to please fill out the evaluation. So every lecture I've given, everyone enthusiastically says they'll do it, and I think we've got about 1 or 2 per chapter filling it out. But it is helpful, and it's of course it's nice to see from my part. So with that, I'll close the summary up and have to answer any questions.
We have one question online already, and I'm just trying to find out who it was. Oh, it's Javid. So Javid Shoki. Hello, Javid. Nice to hear from you. And so the question is as follows. Were the shown experimental relative permeability curves measured under steady state flow or under unsteady state flow conditions?
Those were measured under steady state flow conditions. We haven't developed an approach in our lab to use unsteady state conditions, but you could do it. There's no reason why, in principle, you could do it. But all of ours were measured using steady state flow conditions.
Okay, and Javid also asks, were the capillary pressure curves used in the simulations measured experimentally or were estimated using rock properties and existing correlations?
So they were measured experimentally. We use mercury porosimetry. Now we work with collaborators where we also measure that using force plate techniques and they're still measured experimentally. We do use correlations to construct our simulations based on or constrained by the experimental data. So not going into a lot of detail. That's just needed. But for the Captain Sandstone, for example, again, this isn't the workflow that we think is the commercial workflow, but the one that we were as academics using to demonstrate and validate the approach. We measured curves on 60 rock plugs from the entire vertical interval of the sandstone. So that's what you can do with PhD students and in a lot of time. And so,
Well, Javid is just about to graduate from his PhD.
okay, great, yeah.
Okay, any questions here from the audience on what procedures? Who's going to ask first? From our audience. Yeah.
Thanks, very interesting talk. The regional storage resource there for Europe, have you mapped it in other geographical areas? So I was reading Asia, there's a lot of potential in Asia. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's the answer is yeah, we haven't done the mapping itself, but we compile the mapping has been done by lots of groups and in some places multiple locations. So we have actually, and I think it's published in a conference paper, but we have done the same study for Asia. And we're also now we have a kind of parallel approach where we also look at the physical constraints, so for example, pressure limitations to reservoirs. And long story short, there is a lot of, we have broadly speaking that conclusion as well. So I've seen a recent news item about potential of kind of storage hubs in Asia. I was actually on the distinguished lecture tour in Thailand and in Japan and Indonesia last last month, and so we're talking a lot about that, and I think it is a really exciting opportunity there. So it'd be fantastic if the projects there continue to develop. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
I need to. We speak, press.
Just keep pressing until it turns green, or you?
Well, it may just be that the battery's gone.
Working.
Oh, it was on, it was good. No, there we are.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Sam. That was really interesting, very wide ranging. So if there's no geological constraint or no technical constraint to CO2 storage, what do you think's preventing it doing more?
Yeah, so firstly, this is a bit of a plug, but we have put a lot of effort into this paper. So it's just about the big review paper that was just published last month. Actually I don't have a reference here anyway. But we just involved with a large group from around the world on a review paper, just assessing some sort of CO2 storage and all, including this question of how it could go faster. So there, the business models, business cases, the kind of major limitations. There are a huge number of areas where the business models are clear. So there are at the same time, there essentially market-based models are possible now in the United States, to some extent in Canada. You could argue that they are in Norway as well. But outside of that, we don't have, for example, any sort of market-based incentive to make that happen. The more hands-on approaches here in the UK, it hasn't been successful, but there's a lot of activity right now. It looks like the current approach is really leading somewhere. So we might see the emergence of some major CO2 storage activity here very soon, hopefully, which would help to validate that more kind of hands-on approach. So that's, I think that's the first one to think of. Another issue that comes up a lot is the public acceptance and the public acceptability, which has stopped projects in the past, not just for CCS, but for lots of energy technologies, including renewables. And so a lot of attention, and happily there is a lot of work being done on understanding how to bring the community along with you to make sure that there is public acceptance for CCS. So there are kind of concerns you'd expect around the technology, but in particular the CCS is the association of CO2 storage with the oil and gas industry. So the public trust of the oil and gas industry is lower than for renewable energy companies. So that's an additional issue, and that that needs to be paid attention to as projects develop. Happily, that does seem to be on the radar of most companies and organizations developing projects. So those are the places to get you started.
Just press it till it goes green. Watch it go green. Keep on pressing it. It seems to be.
Yeah, all right. Hello, my name's John Owens, I'm the reservoir engineer. Looking backwards, thinking about CO2 injection for missile recovery, I would have thought that the underlying physics that we discussed is equally questioned or would be applied to, having worked a couple of times on CO2 injection projects where we've had enormous trouble with skew matching CO2 breakthroughs. Now, if the way we're using our upperm curves in the conventional world is somewhat wrong, that would be interesting to know.
Yes, absolutely. I've had that question before, and the answer is yeah. It's I think there's a lot to do. It's more complicated because of the visible flow physics, but the effects should be. So I think there's a real benefit we have by applying this there. We're also working with companies that have seen, they think they see this kind of thing with natural gas storage project, and are interested if it might affect hydrogen storage, the way you kind of manage the the storage volume is might benefit from this approach. So one of the exciting things, I don't have a slide, and I don't think that, so I'm leading it's a project called Strategy. This is funded by the UK government, but it's focused on commercializing the upscaling approach. And because they're working with the University of Cambridge and then the reservoir simulation company and a few energy companies, and the project is designed though so that all of the tools that we develop are publicly available. And the commercial deployment, so what we heard from our energy industry runners were that, well, it's great that you developed this wonderful code, but if we can't call you and get support within when we need it or pay you to get support, we can't use this in our company. So we're trying to get this approach, the tools to characterize a reservoir and apply the upscaling and reservoir simulation software. So we're working on that, and within a few years, we're expecting a few companies to be, and a few software companies to have this embedded in their software and available. So I think there are widespread applications.
Okay. Question from Dr. Richard Doyle, or Dickie Doyle, formerly of Imperial College. He says, the acoustics make listening a little tricky, but I have difficulty appreciating size. What does 1 million tons of CO2 look like? Have you comparisons with other possibly better known sizes? Thanks, Richard. And by the way, anybody who wants to ask a question online, do use the video link. Thanks.
There's a lot of ways to answer that. I kind of make fun, people get carried away as how many swimming pools or elephants stacked to the moon and that kind of thing. There are a few ways that it would be useful to think about it, I think. So people are worried about leaks and CO2 leaking. And they will stand next to a 500 megawatt coal-fired gas-fired power plant, and your leak rate there is 10,000 to 30,000 tons of CO2 per day. So that's kind of 1 million tons per year addition from a power plant. And it's just to kind of emphasize that amount of that CO2 is when it does leak, it's something that doesn't have a huge environmental even health impact immediately. I think getting up into the gigaton scale, commensurate with the size of the oil and gas industry today, is a fairly good scale. 1 million tons per year injected underground. That is that's a fluid rate that's a really productive well. So we don't usually have, like offshore UK, the combined oil water production from wells usually isn't at that volumetric rate. It's kind of like half of that or a third of that. So just to give you a sense of that, but it does seem that companies are confident that 1 million tons per year is fine, or even more, and there are examples of that.
I think you click and you keep on clicking, and I think it steps through. You got it. You're there. Agree.
Right. So, Kev Settler, I'm also a very small engineer. You've shown very nicely some simulations at small scale, at coarse scale, but heterogeneities occur at all scales across the reservoir. So does that mean you need to know the properties of large scale heterogeneities, the geometries, some of which you won't even penetrate well. So there will be that unknown and being able to predict.
Yeah.
Accurate.
I think this question also comes up a lot with this, and I think some of the things that so geological heterogeneity is always going to be a major source of uncertainty. And what I like to emphasize is that first of all, we're not getting rid of geological heterogeneity. What I'm trying to get to is like here. I'm also at the other end of the scale, not saying that you need to characterize everything across all scales in exhaustive detail, or even do more characterization than has been done in the past. That's not what this is about. It's more about acknowledging that you have to take into account the impact of the heterogeneity of the small scale heterogeneity of capillary pressure characteristics, the multi-phase flow characteristics. So it's more about understanding that that aspect of the physics has an impact on field scale flow. How you incorporate that into your models, including the characterization, is up to you. Obviously, if you could characterize everything, you would. But the alternative is, well, you could generate relevant curves that are representative of that impact, for example. And you can acknowledge the uncertainty by generating many versions of that. So just all of the in a familiar way. So it is really about, it's a kind of variation on reservoir simulation where we generate flow functions that embed the impact, the upscale impact of these small scale heterogeneities. How you get that information, again, there are plenty of options. You can base it on your understanding of geology and the sedimentary textures. You can base it on your actual characterization and observations in the well, and so on. Most often, I would say, I should end with this, is actually, we did a lot of work in the lab, but most often we find that the well logs provide essentially nearly all of the information that we need. A number of reasons for this. Usually the heterogeneities at the well log scale kind of overwhelm the impact of the heterogeneities at the centimeter scale. So usually kind of meter to 3 meter scale heterogeneity controls the upscale impact of these things. But it could be different depending on.
Okay, thank you, Sam, for the presentation. I'm Mohammed from 67. Well, my question is not related directly to the simulation. I'm just wondering if the CO2 stores can be reused or reproduced easily in the future.
Or can it be produced?
Yeah.
If it can be produced. You know, the projects aren't being designed for that. It's not to say that it couldn't be produced, but I think if you were designing projects so that you could produce it, you would do things a bit differently. So again, looking into the natural gas storage and how they were doing hydrogen storage, type concepts is what you start to look at. Of course, there's going to be a lot more CO2 stored than there is natural gas stored, but so the short answer is sure. No reason why you couldn't produce that, but projects aren't being designed to make that easy or optimal.
Agree now, yeah. Go past it. I think you clicked 3 times. I think the third one's 3.
Hello.
Yeah.
So thank you, Sam, for the presentation. My name is Jakob from the University of Portsmouth. So I was wondering if you made any large-scale simulations that would, for example, implement the heterogeneity into the real-life case scenarios. So, for example, if you manage to get a better plum simulation and a better plum match to the real life case scenarios.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and the true answer is at the moment no, and until very recently that possibility hadn't been available. So it's like, it might seem like a great case that the reservoir is such that the constraints on the rock material is not good enough. It's just not good enough to be a good validating case. This case, for example, they haven't injected CO2, so there's nothing to validate at the moment. Anyway, but recently, so the CO2 data share portal, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it was essentially developed by Syntef, and it's an online data sharing portal, but expressly for industrial scale CO2 storage projects to share very high quality data about their projects. So as you can imagine, there aren't many projects on our list. I think that is and those would be so the Decatur project, which I did show an image of before, just over the summer released all of their data. And so time-lapse seismic, pre-injection characterization, watching the plume, even their simulations, you can download their geological models, their simulations, their well logs, a huge richness of data. And we think that this is a potentially validating case study, and we're working on it as such. So we're excited by that.
I think we are done. That was utterly excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, everybody online. It was really quite excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll break until 7:15 GMT. And Babak is not yet with us, but I'm hoping he will arrive, or we will find him wandering around Imperial College, and then on to our second distinguished lecturer for the evening. Now, for those who are in Imperial College, we now go down a level for a buffet. Yeah. Okay, so we're ready to go now, right? Right. Okay, we're back. We're back from our buffet, which was very nice. Sausages and lovely sandwiches and glasses of red and white wine. Good music. There was a quartet playing in the room, and plenty of people have passed their business cards around. So I do encourage you in the next month, if you want to come and meet a few people and exchange some business cards. This is the place to be, and the food is brilliant. Is that correct? Can I get okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, we're about 15-ish, 20 people here, all enjoying ourselves. Anyway, so Babak Moradi. Oh, I need this rather than that. No, that's not on. I'm struggling like you guys were. Yeah, good. Now we're there. Okay, so Babak, thank you for coming. It's been a long time. Babak and I first met, but online, across the smoke-filled room 2 or 3 years ago, and we've been in correspondence off and on ever since. And so Babak is going to talk to us on water flood optimization by data analytics on mature fields to accelerate the field development process from months to weeks. And Babak's from 360 Energy, and I'm going to read his abstract to you. Currently, 70% of global oil is being produced from mature fields. The water flood process is widely used to improve the oil recovery of mature fields. Unlocking the potential of existing mature assets and the optimization of water flooding can be challenging using traditional dynamic modeling workflows due to high well counts, years of historical production data, an extensive data set, complex stratigraphy, and etc. However, these challenges create opportunities for data-driven techniques. In addition, increased attention towards reducing carbon emissions makes data-driven techniques more attractive as they are computationally light techniques. Now, firstly, this work reviews classical analytics for the study of the water flood process. After that, machine learning techniques are used to optimize rates of water injection wells for maximizing the production efficiency. Next, an innovative hybrid physics-guided data-driven method is presented to accelerate field development and locate the remaining oil process from months to weeks. The results of this new workflow are validated against outputs of numerical simulation and 4D seismic information. Furthermore, the comparison of post-drilling results and predictions of the new physics-guided, data-driven workflow is presented for a field located in the Middle East. This presentation demonstrates that it is now possible to deliver digital projects capturing the full uncertainty ranges, including complex multi-vintage spatial 4D datasets, and provide reliable non-simulation, physics-compliant, data-driven production forecasts within weeks. The presentation addresses the challenge of reducing mature field study resource intensity and therefore time and costs, whilst maintaining a high degree of fidelity. Babak Moradi has 13, 14, 15 years experience in reservoir engineering. He's been involved in studies of more than 20 mature fields located in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia, the North Sea, and Africa. He is an expert in machine learning and programming, and he's developed several software packages related to petroleum engineering. He is author of 30 scientific publications in areas of EOR, CO2 sequestration, fluid properties modeling, and has published a textbook on fluid flow in the wellbore. His strong background in mathematics and programming helps him to turn data into knowledge. Babak, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, team, for introducing me.
Oh, I've forgotten to say, remember, if you're online, to use the link below the video to ask questions.
Great. Thank you for introducing me. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be a part of this event, and it's my pleasure to be here and presenting to you all. And before starting my presentation, I would like to express my thanks to the team. Actually, he was one of my SPE mentor, and his advice helped me a lot to improve my presentation. Thanks a lot. And a special thanks to the SPE London for inviting me tonight and arranging these events. Today I'm going to talk about water flood optimization by data analytics. First, I will give you a brief introduction to the different method for optimizing the water flood process. I will explain how petroleum engineer can use a classical analytical method as a predictive and diagnostic tools for optimizing the water flow. Next, I will go through the machine learning. As the next step, I will explain the hybrid workflow. I will describe why petroleum engineer needs the hybrid workflow, and during this presentation, I will introduce a new remaining oil mapping method by using the hybrid workflow. During this presentation, we are going to present 3 different case studies located in the Asia Pacific, North Sea, and the Middle East. Actually, during this presentation, we are not going to explain each case study in the details. We aim to provide a sense of how physics can supervise the data-driven models. And at the end, I will go through the conclusion. Currently, more than 70% of the global oil is producing from mature fields. That's why the mature fields are very important for the industry. And when we are dealing with the mature fields, actually, most of the times we have a high well counts and years of historical data that result in a proper data set or a huge data set. And Waterflood has been used widely to improve the oil recovery in the mature field. Currently, we have a few methods for study the process of the water flood in the mature fields. Currently, industry accepts the numerical simulation as the most precise available method, or we call it 3D modeling or numerical simulation. Is a well-established industry accepted as a standard, but as you know, running the numerical simulation is time-consuming. We need intensive resources and also is costly. And for running the numerical simulation, we need the expert as well. To accelerate the simulation times, we need the more powerful machine. That's why in the x-axis I put the time and resource. If we want to accelerate the time, we need more resources. So in another side of the plot, we have some simple analytical method for studying the water flow. Those methods are less precise, but they are quick and fast. But in general, we cannot use those methods for a sensitivity analysis. And during last 10 years, there has been a drive to implement data-driven in our industry. And especially during last few years, everybody is hearing about the data-driven. Those data-driven methods are fast, quick, and enough precise. But I will explain about some of the issues related to the data-driven and why sometimes in the oil and gas industry we have a problem with the data-driven models, and why we need as a petroleum engineer, we need the hybrid workflow. Tonight I will focus mainly in I will focus on the hybrid workflow. Hybrid workflow is a physics-guided data-driven. We try to leverage advantage of both physics and the data-driven models. And by this way, we are precise as a numerical simulation and quick and fast as an analytical method. In general, data analytics is not a new term for a petroleum engineer. Actually, we are using data-driven for many decades. For example, the ARP equation. Petroleum engineers use ARP's equation for many decades for predicting the performance of the oil and gas wells. And even currently, we are using those equations for evaluating the reserves. Most of the time when we want to report the reserves in the industry, still we are using those equations. And one of the main reasons is, as you can see here, all these equations are very simple. Easily we can use them and we can prepare a spreadsheet and we can evaluate the reserves for our fields. That's why still in the industry we are using such a simple method. By the way, when we are dealing with the water flood process, people suggest to use the type curves to come up with the performance of the oil production. Actually, we can plot the water oil ratio versus cumulative liquid. And the reason is because during the water flood process, there is a chance that some of the operational constraints change during the water flood process, and investigating impact of those changes by using the decline curve analysis is a bit challenging. That's why petroleum engineers came up with the idea of the type curves. Here we try to plot the water oil ratio versus cum liquid in the semi-light plots. And after while the trend of the data should be a straight line, we can match the low, mid, high cases. I come up with the forecast of prediction for a liquid production. We can calculate based on the average, or based on the VLT table, we can come up with the liquid production. And by combining these two plots, we can calculate the oil production profiles. We can get the low, mid, high cases. And but here also we can consider the impact of the operation change. If we have some changes in the future, we can consider it in the liquid production. And later on, we can see its impact on the oil production. And through the literature, you can find many classical data-driven method actually. For example, we have a chunk plot, and by using the chunk plot, we can investigate if there is any channel near to our producer or not. We have a hard plot for investigating the water loss in the injection wells, voidage replacement ratio for evaluating the performance of the water flood, Krevor curves to predict the infill well performance, well interaction to calculate the correlation between injector producer. Babak map has a visualization tools to identify unsweep area during the water flood process. As you can see, all of these methods are simple and we can use them as a predictive or a diagnostic tools. By the way, we cannot use this method for a detailed study, and we cannot use them for a sensitivity analysis. They are quick, fast, but they don't provide us the details. Also, they don't provide us the sensitivity analysis or range of the uncertainty. That's why we need a more accurate method. During the last 10 years, data-driven has been successfully and widely implemented in the social sciences. For example, those huge IT companies, Google, Netflix, they are using the data-driven method for last 10 years or 15 years. When we are talking about the social sciences, we are dealing with the huge data set and there is no physics. Actually, there is no physics can predict in the Netflix, which movie are you going to watch as the next? So we don't have such a physics. But Netflix has access to the millions of data or more than that. So that's why those methods was quite successful. And that one resulting to implement such a method in the oil and gas industry. And almost AI is overtaking the world actually. Today, everybody talking about the ChatGPT, and most probably we will hear more and more about the AI and data-driven models. So during, as I mentioned, in the last 10 years, a lot of people try to implement the data-driven in the oil and gas industry. Even some of the operators establish a data-driven department. They hire best scientists, data scientists in those departments, but most of those projects was failed. And because of they hire the best data scientists, but those data scientists didn't have enough domain knowledge in the petroleum engineering. If you look at this plot, here you can see the number of the ice cream cells represented by a green color line and the number of the shark attack in the US. As you can see here, there is a linear correlation between the ice cream cells and the shark attack. When we have more cells in the ice cream, the number of shark attack is increasing. And when we drop in the cells of the ice cream, the number of the shark attack is decreasing. As a data scientist, if I want to come up with the conclusion, I can say, okay, for decreasing the number of the shark attack, it's better we put some limitation on number of the ice cream cells. Is it what I can conclude from this plot actually? If I don't have enough domain knowledge. But we know in the reality it doesn't work. Actually, these two parameters are correlated to each other because of the weather. During the winter, the weather is cold. People are buying less ice cream. Also, they are swimming less. That's why the shark attack is decreasing. And during the summer, the weather is hot, so people like to have ice cream. Also, they go for swimming more frequently. That's why the number of shark attack is increasing. And here you can see the domain knowledge. And this same thing happened in our industry, especially for people who wants to learn about the data science. Before be a good data scientist, it's better be a good petroleum engineer. And when you identify the problem in your department, later on you can use some of data analytics to solve such a problem actually. But you need to be, first you need to be a good petroleum engineer. Second, identifying the problem. And third one, investigate, can we use the data-driven models to solve the problem or not? Currently, we have a few different methods for AI. One is supervised learning. In the supervised learning, we know the actually, we have access to some historical data, and we know the actual answer for those historical data. For example, you want to predict the performance of the oil production for infield targets. Already you have some existing wells, and for those existing wells, you know what is the production data. So you have a historical data, and you know the answer. Now you try to train your models. The model try to learn the physics based on the data, because in the data-driven, we assume the physics is inside the data. And when we train the models, we can use it for a prediction. So in the supervised learning, we have a historical data and the answer. But in the unsupervised learning, we have only the data, and we don't know what is the answer. For example, rock typing. We have a set of data, but we don't know those data belong to which cluster actually, or belong to which group. And the AI or machine learning try to come up with a clustering. So when we are talking about the unsupervised learning, we don't know the answer, and AI try to cluster the data for us. So most of the reservoir engineers in general use the supervised learning, and the geologists normally use the unsupervised learning. Because in the geology, we are dealing with the clustering. For example, rock typing, identifying the lithology, or identify the layers based on the live data. So over there, we don't know the answer, and we need to use the unsupervised learning. Also, we have a reinforcement learning. In this method, the machine learning try to learn based or improve its accuracy based on the new data. In general, we use such a method when we are dealing with real-time data. For example, we have a real-time gauge, and it's very powerful tools for maintenance, because in the maintenance, always for HSC, we have some real-time gauge, so the new data is coming every second. And by this way, the machine learning can improve its accuracy based on the new data. And during this presentation, mostly I will focus on the supervised learning because I'm a reservoir engineer. And here you can see the workflow for machine learning. One of the most time-consuming tasks in the machine learning is data preparation. Preparing a data lake, it can be very time-consuming. And in the subsurface, we can use some parameters related to the static, for example, porosity, permeability, well location, or we can use some parameters coming from dynamic input, for example, water saturation, oil in place, perforation length, or distance from the contact. When we prepare the data set, we assign some portion of our data set to the training and some portion of data to the testing set. In general, we assign 70 to 80% of the data to the training, and we use 20 to 30% of data for testing to evaluate the performance of our models. And in the machine learning, we have a term, we call it overfitting. Maybe our model works only on the specific data and portion of testing and learning data set. If we change or shuffle our data, that model doesn't work well. And we call this issue overfitting, actually. That's why for avoiding the overfitting, we suggest to train the model several times by shuffling the training and testing data set. As you can see here, first I assigned 80% of the data to the training, this 20% to the testing data set. For the next round, I changed the testing data set. Now I use this 20% of data to the for testing and this 80% for training. And we do this job for several times, and by this way we are hoping that we won't have an overfitting issue. And please keep in mind each machine learning techniques produce different outputs. You can have a same data set, same training and testing data set, and if you use two different machine learning techniques, most of the times you will get two different results. And maybe you say which one is right. Well, currently, nobody can answer this question to you. We can look at the performance of the machine learning in the testing data set, but most of the time we will see both two different models also have a good performance in the testing data set, and we cannot say which one is right. That's why we, to solve the issue, we come up with the ensemble modeling. In ensemble modeling, we run several machine learning techniques and we combine the result. We hope to improve the prediction of the ML model beyond each individual neural network, actually. So we come up with the average prediction. So when we are sure about the quality of training, we can add the prediction attribute, and we can move to the forecast step. So as a forecast, we can predict any parameters we like. It can be estimated ultimate recovery, initial water cut, factors, production profiles, or it can be any parameters, depend to your works actually. Here I add these few parameters, but it can be anything. Based on your input data, you can predict the different parameters. And for water flood, actually, here you can see a case study. This field is located in the Asia Pacific. The field has 4 water injector, 14 producer. This field is producing around 6 years. Here you can see the historical data. The solid line showed the prediction or history match by using the ML models. As you can see now, the ML model is almost matched the historical data. As the next step, we vary the injection rates for each injector by 5%, and we try to predict the short-term production profile. And here you can see the short-term profiles. And as you can see here, the short-term profile can drop by -6% or increase by 8%. Depends which injection rate we assign to each producer. By this way, we can optimize the injection rate to come up with the maximum short-term oil production. Also, this workflow can suggest us the most important injector that has a significant impact on the short-term oil production. So, please keep in mind when you are using the machine learning techniques, especially for predicting the rates or profile, it's better to use it for short-term production prediction, not for a long-term. Because when we are dealing with profiles, we need to predict the oil rate at the different months, actually each individual month, and each month can have an impact on the next month. So after a time, we have an accumulated error, and at the end, for example, if you want to predict 20 years of the production, you will come up with a huge error. So based on my experience, when you want to predict the profile, it's better to use the ML only for optimizing the short-term oil production, actually. But for example, for some parameters like EUR, it's only one value. Actually, it's a long-term. We want to predict EUR after the next 10 years or 20 years, but it's only one value. So for that one, we are safe to use the machine learning because it's only one value. But if you want to predict the profile of the wells for each individual month, is not recommended to use the machine learning for a long-term forecast. And as I showed in the previous slide, when we are talking about the machine learning, those methods are quick, fast, they are very light, easily we can implement them, and it's quite quick to update the models. And for running the machine learning, we need plenty of the data actually that may not readily available in the oil and gas industry. This is one of the issues with machine learning techniques. And even sometimes we have a proper data set, but when we run the machine learning, it's very difficult to interpret the results, and sometimes we observe the output of the machine learning doesn't follow the physics. For example, we want to predict the performance of, or we want to predict the saturation, water saturation, and the machine learning suggests us some value above 1 or below 0, because the machine learning is not aware of the physics, so it cannot constrain the result between 0 to 1. We have to do it manually, define it manually for machine learning. So this is one of the main issues with the machine learning. Actually, those techniques doesn't follow the physical constraint, and sometimes it's very challenging to define physical constraint in the machine learning. Another issue we have in the machine learning is the extrapolation issue. We have an extrapolation issue when we want to predict something beyond the observational space. When we are dealing with the machine learning, always we need to have a historical data. For example, we want to optimize the water flood. You need to have some water injection in the history. You cannot use those methods for a forecast mode for a field that you don't have a water injection. And this is another issue. And also in terms of the extrapolation issue, in the reservoir engineering, normally we want to forecast in the future. So we have some historical data till the current time step. And we want to predict beyond the current time step. And this one, again, sometimes the machine learning has an issue because we are dealing with the extrapolation issue. That's why we come up with the idea of the hybrid workflow. In the hybrid workflow, we try to leverage the advantage of both physics and data-driven. In the oil and gas industry, we have a well-established physics. For example, we know the flow in the pros media can be described by diffusivity equation, or we know how we can model the flow in the wellbore. So we know the physics here in the petroleum engineering. Also, we have a less data compared to the social sciences. So in the hybrid workflow, we try to combine physics and data to use the advantage of both workflow and also overcome the weakness of the both data and physics guided. By using the data-driven model, we try to minimize the data mismatch. And by using the physics, we try to constrain the solution space. By this way, the output of the machine learning will follow our physical constraint. And we will have a less issue with the extrapolation, actually. So here, as the next step, I will try to introduce a workflow for locating the remaining goal by using the hybrid workflow. When we are dealing with the water flood in the mature fields, always petroleum engineer likes to know where is the unsweep area, and at that area, how much oil has been left, and if we drill the wells, how much we can produce. These questions are the main question always petroleum engineer or subsurface engineer would like to answer it in the mature fields. And by using this workflow, we try to answer those questions. The workflow you can see here is a time-based process and it's very quick. The input of the workflow is almost similar to the conventional numerical simulation. We need the data-driven, we need the production data because it's a data-driven. Also, we need the log and the geology because it's, we try to implement the physics as a part of our calculation. Also, we can use the 4D seismic if it's available. As a first step of the calculation, we need to calculate two different constraints, one local constraint, another one global constraint. For a local constraint, we convert the historical production data to the Waterflood or a GeoR, and by using the fractional flow, we can convert the Waterflood to the water saturation. By this way, for each historical wells, we can calculate the water saturation at different location of the field and different times based on the historical data. Also, if we have a 4D seismic, we can convert the 4D signal to the water saturation band, and we use that water saturation band as the local constraint. By using this 4D, we can come up with the minimum and maximum water saturation at different locations of the reservoir. And for global constraint, we can use the material balance. We know the initial oil in place, and also we know how much oil we produce. And by using the material balance, we can calculate the remaining oil at the different flow units and different times. And for considering the impact of the physics, we use the fast matching method. Here we try to calculate flow potential. By this way, the engine knows when we have a channel, the water should move faster, or when there is a fault, the water should stop at that point and it shouldn't move beyond the force. And by combining this local global constraint flow potential and implementing a search engine, we can come up with a saturation map. We use a search engine, search optimizer, to calculate the saturation map that is consistent with the local constraint calculated from fractional flow. And also the total remaining oil over the map should match the material balance. Here you can see I have two errors. One is the water saturation, or what we calculated from a local constraint, and another error is material balance. So the search engine tried to calculate the shape of the water saturation for us. Now this water saturation should match with the historical data at the existing wells, and total remaining oil should be matched with the material balance. Okay, in general, in the first iteration, we will see some mismatch, but after a few iterations, you can see the improve of match is increasing, and after a while, the match is perfect for both parameter, or is very small error. We will observe very small error. And by this way, we can say we converge, and now we can have some output similar to the reservoir simulation. We can have a water saturation, a stock oil tank in place, movable oil in place, or sweep efficiency. So the output can be exactly similar to the numerical simulation. And to validate the result of the new workflow, I will show you three different cases. The first case study, we try to compare the result generated by new hybrid workflow against the numerical simulation. The second case study is a comparison between new hybrid workflow and the 4D seismic. And the last case study is a comparison between new hybrid workflow and post-drilling result. The first case study is located in the Asia Pacific. This field has around 300 wells. Still more than 100 of those wells are active, and this field is highly heterogeneous. Here you can see the stock tank oil in place at the initial time. So actually, for both hybrid and numerical simulation, those maps are exactly the same because it's calculated based on the input data set, based on the static models. But for future time set, the map will be different because it's calculated based on two different workflows. Here you can see the second time set, third, and the last time step end of the history. As you can see here, there is a quite nice match between these two maps, between the hybrid workflow and the numerical simulation. For a comparison, I pick 5 different control areas at the different location of the reservoir, and we calculate the oil in place inside those control areas. And here you can see the comparison between hybrid workflow and numerical simulator for those 5 areas. As you can see, for all of those areas, the accuracy is above 85 to 90%. So here it shows a quite great match between the hybrid workflow and the numerical simulation for same input data set. And the advantage of the new hybrid workflow is the calculation times. This type of workflow are very quick. So for this study, actually, we use a commercial numerical simulator, and the running time by using the commercial numerical simulator was 7 hours. And using the the hybrid workflow took only 6 minutes. From 7 hours, we accelerate the calculation to 6 minutes. And this is the main advantage of the hybrid workflow. Now, as an engineer, we can run multiple realization in the very quick time, very quickly, actually. in a short time frame, you can have a multiple realization and come up with the range of the uncertainty, actually. Come up with the P10, P50, P90 remaining goal maps, actually. This is one of the main advantage of this type of the workflow. The second case study is located in the North Sea, here in the UK, actually. This field has 40 producers, and this field is highly mature. The recovery factor of the field is about 50%, and most of the wells produce high water cost, and that's why engineer couldn't come up with a proper history match. Actually, when in the industry, when we are dealing with the mature fields with the high water cost, it's very difficult to match the historical data of those wells. And when we want to drill the infill wells, it's important to have a proper match at the well levels, because most of the time in the mature fields, we can reach the good match at the field levels, but when we look at the well levels, we see some mismatch, actually. But when we want to drill the infill wells, it's very important to have a good match at the well levels, because we are drilling between those wells, and if the wells are not matched, so there is a high chance the remaining well also intra the wells is not correct, actually. So we implement a new hybrid workflow for this field. Here you can see the initial trimester, the results calculated as a second trimester, third, and end of the history match. And here you can see the remaining oil maps, actually. The red color show the high amount of oil has been left inside the reservoir, and the blue is the area that we have a low amount of oil, actually. And by this map, we can come up with the decision where is the oil has been left and where we can drill the new infill wells. For this field, we have access to the 4D seismic. Actually, 4D seismic is a normal practice in the North Sea. So here you can, in the left side of the slide, you can see the contact movement calculated by using the 4D seismic. And in the right side, you can see the saturation change calculated by new hybrid workflow. As we can see, there is a nice match between these two maps. Actually, when we have a high contact movement calculated by 4D seismic, we can see the large saturation change also generated by new hybrid workflow. By the way, in some of the area, you will see some mismatch. For example, here, this area, you will see some mismatch. The new workflow shows there is a low amount of water saturation change, but 4D seismic suggests us there is a high amount of water contact movement change. As I mentioned, we can use the 4D seismic as a local constraint as a part of the calculation. By the way, for this comparison to be fair, we haven't used the 4D seismic. And as a next step, we add the 4D seismic and we try to constrain remaining oil map by using the 4D seismic. And we found by adding the 4D seismic, even we can achieve the good quality of the match even for those areas. And everywhere we will see a consistent map between the new hybrid workflow and 4D seismic if we constrain the result by 4D. And by the way, I can say this area is not important area for petroleum engineer, because we found in most of the area that we have a mismatch between these 4D seismic and unconstrained result. The quality of reservoir is very poor in those areas, and the oil in place also is very small, actually. Normally, we are interested in the place that we have a high volume of the oil or good quality of the reservoir. The third case study is located in the Middle East. This is a heavy oil. the viscosity of the oil is around 100 to 1000 centipoise. That's why we have a early water breakthrough for each producer, and the recovery factor of the field is very low. Here we have a oil in place at the initial trimester, and you can see the calculated stock oil in place by using the new hybrid workflow. And this is the remaining oil at the end of history match, actually, by using the new hybrid workflow. As I mentioned, this workflow is quick. And for this particular field, we have a high uncertainty related to the some static and dynamic parameters, and we try to run multiple realization. Here you can see the workflow for capturing the uncertainty by using the new hybrid workflow. First, we need to define a list of the uncertain parameters. The uncertainty can be related to the static or dynamic parameters. It can be porosity, permeability, or it can be some uncertainty related to the production allocation rate or PVT. When we define the list of the uncertain parameters, we keep all the parameters as a need case, and we use the one variable as the turn techniques, and we change one of those parameters to the low and high cases. And by this way, we can understand the impact of that parameters on the remaining oil mapping. And for understanding the impacts, we suggest to pick a different control area at a different location of the fields and plot the tornado plots. Actually, for each control area, we can plot the tornado like this. And by this way, we can identify the main uncertain parameters. For this particular field, as you can see, I present one of the tornado plots, and based on this tornado plot, the main uncertain parameters is the propellant, is the water oil contact level, and welfare. And maybe we can ignore the impact of the allocation, oil formation volume factor, and viscosity for this particular field. When we identify the main uncertain parameters, we can combine those parameters, and we come up with a list of the realization. For this particular field, we run more than 40 subsurface realization by using the new hybrid workflow. As I mentioned, this workflow is very quick, so you can run multiple scenarios. Here we run around 40 different realizations. We calculate the remaining oil mass. And later on, we combine the output of the remaining oil mass. By this way, we can calculate some statistical maps, like a P10, P50, P90 maps. Also, we can come up with the risk map by combining all the results. And when we have such a maps, we can identify the infill target. In general, we are interested to the area that we have a IP50 remaining oil maps and lower risk. So by this way, we can identify the infill targets, also rank those infill targets. And as the next step, we can use the machine learning to predict the performance of those infill targets. So the prediction can be EUR, water cut, or type curve, or production profile. And one of the beauty of this workflow is now we have access to the remaining oil map at the different time method. In the conventional data-driven or ML models, only we have access to the static inputs or initial time method data. For example, porosity, permeability, initial parameters at the initial time method. But by using the hybrid workflow, now we have access to the some time-lapse information. For example, water saturation, volume place, or different maps at different time methods. And we can use those maps as a part of training the dataset to improve the quality of the prediction. And this is one of the main beauty of this hybrid workflow. Here you can see actually the comparison between the result predicted by hybrid workflow and post-drilling result. Actually, we identified 10 infill targets based on the hybrid workflow, but later on, after some economic study, operator decided to drill 4 infill targets based out of those 10 wells. So here you can see the post-drilling result. Actually, for those 4 infill target has been drilled. The yellow color does show you the post-drilling result, actual result after drilling the wells. And those lines show you the P10, P50, P90 trend calculated by using the new hybrid workflow. As you can see, for all 4 wells, the actual result falling in the P10, P90 bands and follow the P50 trends, except the well number 2 that mostly follow the P90 trends. And as you can see here, there is a fairly nice match between the prediction of the hybrid workflow and the actual post-drilling result. And all of this work has been done in the few weeks. You know, if you want to do the proper history match by using the conventional method, it takes several months. But now, by using the hybrid workflow, we can have a proper range of the uncertainty in the few weeks. And if you are interested to know about more details about this case study, maybe you can refer to this SPE paper actually. Yeah. So maybe I can conclude my talk. Okay. All of us should prepare ourselves for a rapid change in amount of data-driven happening in our industry in the next few years, actually. And today, AI-based technology enable operators to implement the practical digitalization solution along the subsurface discipline. We can use the digital solution for reservoir management, field development, or any task actually in the subsurface discipline. So all of us should brace ourselves for such a rapid increase in amount of data-driven innovation in our industry. And as I show you here, we can have some hybrid workflow. Those hybrid workflow prove that can deliver multiple subsurface realization in a few weeks. That is a challenging task by using the conventional numerical simulation. Actually, by using the hybrid workflow, you can run multiple subsurface scenarios, so easily you can capture the uncertainty. Also, this new hybrid workflow can leverage the advantage of both for physics and data-driven models. And by this way, physics can supervise the machine learning method, and also physics can generate high-order data that later on we can use it in the machine learning to improve the quality of results. And by this way, we can unlock the remaining oil remaining oil potential in the short-term time frame and more cost-effective manner, actually. And and there is another conclusion I haven't added here because I didn't do much study in the proper way. But these new hybrid workflow are very light. You can run it in your personal laptop. So you need the less energy and electricity for running those methods. But for running the numerical simulation, you need a powerful machine. You need to run it in the cloud or server. So you need more energy. And when we are using those light methods, we are using less energy. It means we are producing less carbon and we are saving our environment. So nowadays everybody is talking about the CO2 emission. So this type of method also can help you to reduce the CO2 emission actually, because they are much lighter in terms of the computation. And last thing about this picture, The machine learning techniques can be a strong tools, but it's a matter who is using those techniques. So if you are a good petroleum engineer, machine learning techniques can give you a quite powerful tools, and you can solve your problem much easier actually. But if you don't have enough domain knowledge, and also you want to use the machine learning, there is a high chance you come up with the unrealistic result, and it can be very dangerous actually. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. Also, I would like to say thanks again to the team for helping me to improve my presentation. And also your feedback is very important for me and SPE. So it would be great if you scan this QR code and fill up the evaluation form after this meeting. Thank you, everybody. And
Thank
now
you.
this floor is
Okay, who would like to ask a question? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Saleh Khamis. I'm an electrical engineer, and I work in the area with water flooding. And the past maybe 10 years, I noticed that there are no many technology deployment with the water flooding technologies. For example, electromagnetic technology or seismic that goes far from the wellbore. And I always see most of the publication are within the area of simulation, history matching, and improving in that aspect. Now, you mentioned in your presentation that there are successful decisions were taken based on the history matching and the machine learning approach or all numerical simulation. Can you touch on the unsuccessful decision were taken based on those simulations? And also, where do you see the technology development for reservoir monitoring or water flooding and the next, let's say, 20 years? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. In general, nobody like talk about unsuccessful cases. Always we try to show the successful cases, especially about the new technology. When we are talking about the new technology, everybody like to show the success of those technologies. But as you mentioned, okay, we are using the numerical simulation for many decades, and here in the UK or North Sea or anywhere in the world, you can find a lot of drivers has been released. So the same thing can happen also based on the new machine learning techniques. So in the subsurface, we have a lot of uncertainty actually. So still we don't have a proper way to measure those uncertainties. So when we don't have a proper input data set, there is a high chance you come up with the wrong decision, rubbish in, rubbish out. So one of the issues in the subsurface discipline is still we have a high uncertainty in the input data set. So that's why we can have drivers anywhere around the world and based on any techniques. It doesn't matter which techniques you are using. And about the second question, about the future of the technology, in my opinion, this is a very challenging question. I hope I could predict something. But based on my opinion, we will hear more about those hybrid workflow, data-driven and hybrid workflow. And for sure, one of the best way to monitor the water movement is a 4D. Actually, I think in the next 20 years, we will see some advancement in the 4D actually. And currently in North Sea, in the Norway side, for example, for some of the fields, they do 4D seismic every 2 years actually. And that one can provide us a good sense about where is the water. But still in terms of the resolution, 4D is not good. So, and I think it will improve a lot in the future. Yeah, I hope I could answer the question. You're welcome.
Hello, again. Hi, Patrick Jennings from Tullamore. Thank you very much for your talk. It's not something I'm so familiar with, the data-driven techniques. As you were talking through, you seem to be using data-driven techniques to almost like control something that looked like a typical 3D numerical simulation. And I was sort of interested in, like, if you went the other way, have you looked at really dumbing down how you map your reservoir so that you're not having to make all these physics assumptions about permeability and saturation, which actually takes a lot of the cycle time for actually building a model. Reducing the way you model or map reservoirs to say, yeah, well, actually, it's just a system with a bunch of wells, and there's distances between the wells, and I know all my production history, and then sort of just looking at what you can actually learn with a very sort of simplistic model like that, or even just an area map with well locations.
Thank you for interesting question. Okay, what you are asking is ignoring those maps. Actually, we are using those maps to consider the impact of the physics actually in the hybrid workflow, because somehow we need to consider the physics in our calculation, and those permeability maps can tell you where is the channels, where the water moves faster or slower, or porosity can tell you about the pore volume, where we have a high volume of the oil, or which area we have a lower volume of the oil. So to consider the physics, we need to have such a maps actually. But the beauty of this method is you can run multiple scenarios. For example, you have an uncertainty about the your saturation maps, permeability maps, or porosity map, or even the shape of a structure. Because I know I used for one of the fields belong to the Tallow, and even there was a high uncertainty about the shape of the fields actually. So here you can run multiple scenarios in the very short time frame to come up with the answer. But to answer your question, yes, we can use only historical data, and as I show in, can I use that laptop maybe? Sorry. Here, oh, sorry. Or maybe I can. Okay. This case study, as I show, only we use the historical production data and some value from the raw data, and predict the short-term oil production for existing well. Also, you can use it for infill target. But mapping a proper map of the remaining oil map needs some mapping, needs some input maps actually. But if you want to predict only a profile data for infill targets or existing wells, you can use data driven only based on the historical data and ignore those and porosity maps. Is it possible actually? I hope I could answer it.
Yeah, I think what I had in mind was a very simple one. All the experts in this by the end of the day. Well,
what I had in mind was just a very simple area map without necessarily the porosity, the saturation representation. Just wells, but look those and maybe you need saturation in there as well, but by placing a well in a location and you understand the distances to other wells, yeah, if you can actually be predictive about what you actually get out of a well at that location.
Yeah, here is actually I try to do the same thing for existing wells. I use only based on the historical data, the production profile based on the existing well. And also you can extend it to the infill wells somewhere between the wells. For example, you can calculate the distance from existing wells, what is the distance from aquifer, and come up with some sort of the forecast. In the practice, is it possible actually? And later on also you can come up with some simple mapping actually. In the practice is possible. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Raj from CMG. Thank you for the great presentation and thanks Tim for choice of presentation. Very extreme two sides of the word. Sam was talking about millimeter scale, very small details and how they can affect the flow behavior. And Babak is talking about very different scales. Is predicting water saturation maps with very limited, bit small, if you like, number of inputs. So I would it would be very interesting to have Sam's take on. Oh, sorry.
You're okay. You just have to tolerate the fact there's going to be feedback because it's picking up there. Right? Try and talk quietly into it closer.
Right.
It's a pain, but it's best we got.
No.
Or even just speak loudly and be picked up by the
Yeah, just what I was saying, that it would be very interesting to have Sam's take on this work and how that
talk towards the Jabra.
Yeah.
And then you'll be heard.
Okay. Well, the point I was making is that Sam was talking about very different scales and how that can affect the flow, like the PC and the way that it changes the channels and the ultimate recovery and things like that. And this is a very different presentation talking about the other side of the stream. So it would be interesting to have these two distinct vectors, if you like, take on each other's work, how they can work together and where is the compromise.
Okay, thank you for a nice comment. Yes, these type of workflow are good in the larger scale. When you are talking about the forest scale, because in the 4 level, we have a limited data. And even if we have a data, those data is limited to the few samples. So it's very challenging to upscale the forest scale to the field level. And especially if you want to use the machine learning. And you mentioned you are from CMG. Okay, maybe I can add something to my presentation here. Please keep in mind, such a method is not a replacement for a reservoir simulation. Because this method works good, for example, in the water flood. They are good in the largest case. But if you need the upper study in the very detailed study, or if you have some advanced EUR method in your reservoir, for example, polymer flooding, ESP, any chemical flooding. For such a situation, I highly recommend to use physics-based models or numerical simulation, because in those physics-based models, always we consider the most of the physics, at least based on our best knowledge, what we know based on the current knowledge. So we can consider a lot of reaction between rock and fluid and fluids. So for such an advanced process, I highly recommend to use the numerical simulation, or if you want to come up with a more detailed study. So it's a proper way is the numerical simulation. But for some simpler workflow, like a Waterflood process, such a hybrid workflow can be great actually. It can accelerate your workflow a lot actually and reduce the field development planning time to the few weeks actually. Yeah. You're welcome.
Okay, I will try and project so that the audience outside can hear. And it's a bit of a question, an observation and a story, which I hope will make you laugh. So in the 90s, I was involved with.
Stand up and go to the camera. Go to the, this is getting that story. We want you in the camera.
Right. So in the 90s, I was involved in the FDP for a water flood field in Denmark, a chalk field, and the FDP happened. It was implemented, and in true oil field fashion, I moved on to a different job. Didn't know what had happened. In the wisdom, 10 years later, they decided to have me back in the same company in order to evaluate the reserves of the field that I got the FDP approved from. And I used a form of your decline curve, not any of the ones that you commented, but a slightly different one. And the reason why I did that was because the form of the field, the form of the maths, meant that I was using linear fits, and therefore I could apply linear uncertainty analysis. You have all the formulas, so you can work out what the errors are in your slope and intercepts and the correlation. So that's fine. That was built into a Monte Carlo, and I could make hundreds of realizations and come up with a curve. I came up with an estimate of the recovery, which was higher than the client was happy with. And his argument was that although I had the physics correct, like you might have, I didn't take into account the state of the wells, the difficulty of maintaining wells at high water cut, the practical problems of running a field over a long period of time. So the question you were asking about failure, at that point, I felt that I failed. As a reservoir engineer, I wasn't able to capture enough of what was going on in the field, make a credible forecast. I mean, no decisions. This wasn't a decision basis. It was just a forecast.
Yeah,
yeah. So not quite what you're doing. 10 years, no, last year, a reserves company, who shall remain nameless, but based in this city, published that they had done a reserves estimate on the given field. It was exactly my P50 from that forecast.
Well done.
Hooray! So, yes, you know, analytical methods should never be underestimated, I think, because what you're doing is combining analytical methods with sort of spatial, you know, I could have subdivided the block up in the field up. I had about 6 or 7 areas of the field. I could have created hundreds of different areas if I had enough time, which would have been virtually what you've done. Or anyway, what I'm just saying is there is good work here, but don't ever give up.
No, I totally agree with you. I have the same experience as well, or maybe I can add it. I was involved greenfield actually. They drill 3 wells, and we observe a very steep decline actually. So one of my colleagues on the it showed the well can produce for next 10 years actually. This story backs to 2017, yeah. And they predict they can the production can go beyond 2030. After that period, also they can implement the water injection and continue production. But when I was looking at the production data, my data analytic method, I use some simple data analytic type curves to predict the forecast of those wells. And I come up, those wells can produce only for a few months. And my prediction was at 27 December, those wells will die actually. And as a joke, I mentioned this is a Christmas gift for a company. And by chance, I can say by chance, exactly at 27, the rate falling below the economic rates, and it's they had to stop the production. I can say this one was by chance. Data analytics cannot predict such accurately, but yeah, I totally agree. Never we should underestimate the actual data, because those actual data are actual response from the reservoir. Is the way the reservoir is talking to us. But for a numerical simulation, we use some sort of input, and there is a high chance those inputs are not right. So our output will be wrong. It doesn't mean the calculation are wrong. Mainly the issue is our input data set. But in the data analytics, such a decline curve analysis, we are looking into actual behavior of the reservoir, and I totally agree with you. Never we should underestimate those simple analytical methods. That's why I see petroleum engineers use those methods. Yeah, thank you for your comment.
Now, can I make another comment?
Yeah, if you go, you need to go towards the Javid, so everybody else can hear you.
You have a stage.
Stand up and off you go.
Sorry, no, I have been working with operational forecast. I'm a reservoir engineer as well from CMG, but I have been working, for a long time also in operational forecast. And there is a world, after the well, right? And we are always, there are lots of analytics that what they do is like, they take the volumes of the wells, we add them up, we add the decline curves, and then, that's normally what we submit, right? But we forget that we have a plant that, have probably, half of capacity, 50% of the capacity, because we have separators, we have networks, and maybe have flow assurance, and they have a different capacity from what we design. And then we have planned and unplanned deferments, which are, normally based on monsoon seasons, on winter, etc. And nothing of that goes to any of this long-term production, profiles that we submit, right? And let go of the contracts, right? If we have a contract with a company that has, it was canceled because of any political, etc. reason, right? So that's my only uptake, right? That we do a lot of declines, and it's basically whatever comes from the pipes or whatever comes from there, from the tube. But it's important that we also understand the chokes in the system.
Hey,
thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Anybody else want to make a remark? Well, we have no questions from our virtual audience, so any last questions? Any last comments from you, Babak? Anything you want to say before to close the meeting?
Okay. The main thing I want to say, thanks to the SPE London for arranging this event. But in terms of technical job, what I can say, especially for those who want to learn the data science, first you need to identify the problem in the field that you are working, and data analytics cannot be the solution all the time. Sometimes, as people mentioned here, data analytics can be a simple classical analytical method can be provide you much better answer, or a proper physics-based numerical simulation can do the job better. You must identify at which situation you can use the advanced ML models. And also there is another thing, it's good to know a bit about the calculation in the ML techniques, because you cannot use all those techniques for all the problems, because I already observed such a thing in the industry. Some people was using some of the techniques, and I was knowing based on the mathematics behind those techniques, those models are not suitable for such a calculation. So it's good at least, some basic stuff about the calculation behind the ML model, and after that implement those techniques for solving your issue. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Babak. Okay, well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you everybody indeed. So I hope to see you in a month's time, 28 days, when Saipem will be talking about unmanned systems. And Babak, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it for answering this. Thank you.
Okay.